not Chiang. Chiang was corrupt, pocketing a lot of the money, but Mao was a communist. And so the Civil War raged after the war, after World War II. By 49, actually, Truman pulled back some aid from Chiang Kai-shek because there was pretty clear evidence that he was just pocketing the money. But then it happened so fast that it's hard to even, it was hard to comprehend at the time, even though a similar thing would happen to Cuba too. The nationalists, starting in the late summer of 49, but by November 49, their army just collapsed. They outnumbered communist guerrillas 15-1, and their army just bled away. And soon, Chiang Kai-shek had to make a very hasty, panicky invasion, or a panicky escape to an island that the Chinese got from Japan, Formosa. And they would create, now we had 2 Chinas. It happened just like overnight, trying to get it up here. Nationalist China, but today you always refer to it all the time as Taiwan. And that's on the little island of Formosa. And then the People's Republic of China, but at that time, everybody in the United States called it Red China. And they were bad China. They were commies. And there were 2 of them. There are 2 essentially independent countries, but only one is recognized. Up until 1979, the US only recognized Taiwan as the real China. And they had that seat on the Security Council. That's a big deal. Remember, that seat has a veto. The US would not recognize the People's Republic until 1979, where they literally just closed the door in Taipei of the embassy, took the sign down, turned it into a consulate, because we do not recognize the country of Taiwan. Nobody does. Because the People's Republic just goes insane if you ever even talk about it and consider that an act of war. But the Cold War really would focus around that, and to American Truman Doctrine thinking, Mao was not acting alone. Who was really pulling on the strings for him? Good job. And as it turned out, Stalin did not like Mao. They were bitter rivals. But to Americans, they just couldn't imagine that. Stalin saw Mao as a threat. And Mao wanted up the leadership of this communist revolution. But in the US, the cry went out, who lost China, and gave it to Stalin. And this massive country, the largest country in the world now, like a roll of dominoes falling. Mongolia, China, Manchuria, China would scoop up. They did the same thing in Tibet, which was an independent country. China just scooped up, and now rules basically as a unbelievably harsh in Tibet. You have a question?
Isn't that like where the Dalai Lama's from?
Yeah.
That makes no sense. Why would they want it?
They wanted the land. They wanted the resources there, so they just took it. And then, doesn't that, who knows where it ends? The domino theory. And it went through domestic politics. And the cry for who lost China? Well, Truman's the one with his Truman Doctrine that scared everybody. So Truman and the Democrats are going to be blamed. And so much of this is going to be about domestic politics then. No politician is going to want to do something like losing China. No politician is going to be be put in a position where they're going to be called soft on communism. So they must look tough. Couple things. First off, this is like the math I saw as a kid. Red, blue. You notice the Mercator projection where they kind of spread it out here to get the north? So look how big when they spread out Greenland. It looks bigger than Africa. All these Mercator projections make Africa look so much smaller because they try to get the north in there and make Greenland, which is about 1/10 of that size. And there's one more thing. Mao claimed this revolution will spread like a million locusts. So that's where you get that Time magazine with the million now red locusts. And by the way, if a million grasshoppers are coming at you regardless of color, it'd be a little scary. But if they're red, run. Huh? Say it again.
Kind of ironic.
You did. It's a good picture though. And so the National Security Council, so that's created by the National Security Act, they wrote this might shock you, their 68 memorandum, thus the name NSC 68. And then it was an absolute panicky memo after China, basically saying that the United States the United States is about to be overrun. it greatly exaggerated the Soviet threat and said the U.S. must begin a massive military buildup. Only the U.S. can stop the Soviets. I already mentioned that the U.S. had started the selective service and it started building up the military, but this was basically telling Truman, if you don't do this, not only will the Soviets lose, but you and the Democrats will be blamed. And so, this is a big shift in the Cold War. Now it's the United States must begin to build weapons. It's no coincidence that right after this, Truman, who had been hesitating about this, he was told about a massive atomic bomb. It was so big, basically it was no longer a fission, but a fusion bomb, but a fission bomb. In fact, it required an atomic bomb to set it off. It was such a big bomb that no one knew how big it could be. They called it the super. And he said right after this, right after NSC 68, he asked, can the Soviets build this bomb? It could be many millions of tons of TNT. And he said yes. So Truman responded with, why the hell aren't we? And so they started building the hydrogen bomb right after this. The arms race was heating up dramatically. Heating up in the Cold War. I'm sorry about the temperature references. But this, in the middle of this, a panic, a hysteria would begin. Like the Red Scare and the Palmer Raids after World War I. But this was much different. HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. Sometimes you see it just simply called the Un-American Activities Committee. And this was all about domestic politics. The domestic politics have shown you're looking tough. So the whole thing is being driven by domestic politics. That's actually kind of scary. So many escalations of the Cold War will not be driven by events around the world. They'll be pushed by events between the parties, especially the party out of power. And originally they're supposed to look for fascists. They begin to look for communists. But it became a vehicle for Republicans in HUAC. And they're the minority party. But Republicans to look out for or to accuse Democrats of being soft on communism. And some Democrats, basically useful idiots, joined up with them to prove they're tough on communism. Now they interviewed a number of people, brought them up, and basically grilled them on whether or not they might have some connection to the Communist Party. And some might have. A few people tinkered with communism and socialism, especially during the Depression. But they really focused on Hollywood and this elite who were supposedly shaping our culture. And these so-called creative people were in reality undermining America by promoting decadent and degenerate ideas. And it went in everywhere from communism in government and ideas about unification in government and all people being equal, but also such things as sexual wars and how people interpersonal relations. And it said that this cultural elite was destroying the country. Culture is more of an 70s term, but that's what they said. And this is still a common theme to this day. Accusing the media of being, passing these degenerate issues. And they begin to interview hundreds of screenwriters, directors, and actors. And here's the big thing is, they would lay out some kind of connection to communism, but the big thing they wanted for them is to do what? Name names. They wanted other people. And if they were not willing to do that, and said, no, I will not tell you other people, real or not real, they would be blacklisted. Remember the blacklist? And thousands, whether it be actors, screenwriters, would not be allowed to work. Many of their career would be destroyed. Some would not get jobs again to the 1960s until the blacklist ended. And just all it took was an accusation. So the Red Clown, that was the name, derogatory nickname to all these communist screenwriters, that they're all Reds. Most of it was totally made up. But the thing was, people were so geared up, they thought that there must be communists there. Here's some of the most famous actors in America. That's Norm McCall, Humphrey Bogart, Betty Davis, Danny Kaye. Bogart's one of the most famous actors in America. And they're all there, and they were accused of being a communist, and they all, like most of them, gave names. They capitulated. Everybody was so afraid. And so there's a couple things about this. First off, the brand new television, don't watch it because it's full of commies. But here shows you how Hollywood. There's a couple movies like this. This was a real movie. I Married a Communist. And by the way, I should be clear about it. The movie looks bad, doesn't it? It's worse than it looks. It's a lot worse. Yeah.
So if they use fake names and then like someone found out about that, would they also be put on the blacklist?
Well, if you give a fake name in Congress, that's perjury.
Okay.
So you can't even get fake names.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Maybe it's good. It's a good question, but they didn't even care if you gave names if they're real communists or not.
Okay.
They just want you to give names.
Okay.
And then one more thing: who's the villain? Yeah, women. As we all know, women are immoral and they bring men down. And by the way, saying that is a very common theme throughout literature, throughout entire history. It's actually pretty shocking how often that happens, that women are the evil one. And obviously that's true, right? I mean, look at her. She's a nameless, shameless woman. And of course, men are noble and pure. Right? Who agrees? Not even the men. See, you're very smart. Good for you. But no, that's actually a very common thing, that women would be more susceptible to this. And so Ronald Reagan, right there, was an actor on decline. He actually did commercials for the Democratic Party in the New Deal, and he did a complete 180 for this. He was convinced they were communists, and not only did he give hundreds of names of people whose careers would be destroyed because of this, he wanted to work undercover, was convinced there were communists everywhere. He would be recruited then, almost cultivated, to become a spokesperson for a new growing kind of very small conservative movement that would grow and then expand during the Vietnam War. And then eventually in the 1970s, when the bad economy in the 70s, they had a huge resurgence and would take over the Republican Party and still control it to this day. Probably significantly more conservative than he was. But it's interesting how he started there. That's him testifying at HELOC. They got a job, General Electric hired him as a corporate spokesman for that television show, they had movies. And he'd become the governor of California. It's pretty interesting how that all happened. So, not only that, there was a loyalty oath craze. Everybody started doing loyalty oaths. They started demanding loyalty oaths for federal government jobs, state government jobs. Here's a loyalty oath for a teacher. I love how they cross out swear, because that means they don't want to swear. Which, wait a minute, there's a lot of different definitions of swear. I do think that's really funny. But that's a teacher must give a loyalty oath, not only put the right hand up and swear allegiance to the United States of America, but then sign a card saying, I'm not a communist. I will faithfully commit to the Constitution of the United States. There's a couple teachers that would be canned because of this. They started doing it everywhere. Schools started doing it, classrooms started doing it, companies started doing it. People started demanding loyalty oaths to come in and shop at your store. You must pledge allegiance that you're not a communist in front of stores. This happened in every place. This a loyalty oath craze. And Truman, who by then was so scared about being accused of a communist, even though he thought it was a bunch of garbage, he demanded loyalty oaths. And here's the thing. You don't give loyalty oaths to find communists. I mean, just imagine if one of you were a communist spy, wanted to overthrow the economy. I saw your hand go up right there. So you're a spy, right? You're a spy. And they said, okay, we're going to prove you're not a communist, and everybody must come up and give a loyalty oath. What's the first thing you would do? Yeah, tell me what, I'll do it. Yeah, of course you would. Where do I sign? It's not like you start signing and the paper catches on fire. Ah, they caught me, I'm a communist. I knew it, I could never do this. No, it catches nobody. Do you know why you do this? That's the two things. First off, it scares people, and it enforces social unity. Anybody who did say, wait a minute, we have a freedom of speech here, and I'm not going to do that, commie. Remember total war. Social unity, all together. It's no coincidence that states started passing laws that every student in school must pledge loyalty to the flag, aka the Pledge of Allegiance. That's when it became state law. Every state passed that law. And that's why in 1951, they showed that we're not godless commies. They had it under God in this craze. And that's where all of that happened, to show we're not communists. That's the history of that. And then, no way. less than 2.5 months after Mao Zedong's communists won in China, Joe McCarthy would burst onto the scene. He's a Republican junior senator from Wisconsin, and what he did was he became the mouthpiece to attack Democrats. And he began to make accusations. And all it took was an accusation, and somebody's entire life could be ruined. In fact, a lot of people committed suicide after they were accused because their life was over. It was a terrifying time. And we're going to watch just a little bit of a video clip, about 10 minutes.
Come on, baby.
One of the best video, or one of the best series on the 1950s called The 50s. And it was done by, okay, there's this channel, and I've mentioned this once before, it's called the History Channel. And they actually did this, and this show has nothing related to UFOs, nothing about pawn shops, nothing about ice road truckers, and not one reference to, did I say UFOs? Oh, to sharks. Not one. The History Channel used to have history. This is actually, it's the best series. We will watch a full one of these about the 3 big events that happened in the civil rights movement in the 1950s called The Rage Within. We'll watch part of this. So here's McCarthy. Maybe.
Let's have some fun. Come on, baby.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many. One communist among the American advisors at Yalta. Where's one communist too many?
Joseph R. McCarthy liked to call himself Tail Gunner Joe, although he had only sat behind a tail gun as a publicity
He
stunt.
was in the Marines.
For 4 brutal years, the junior senator from Wisconsin reigned as the country's self-appointed commie hunter supreme.
Joe McCarthy was a black-jowled, scowling, kind of sinister-looking person with a 5 o'clock shadow and a lumbering gait. And yet those who got to know him found him to be gregarious. He had the sort of the appeal of a tramp dog wagging its tail.
Joe McCarthy had little to show for his first 4 years in Washington. A group of newspaper correspondents named him the worst member of the United States Senate. With re-election approaching, he was a candidate desperate for an issue. On February 9th, 1950, McCarthy arrived in Wheeling, West Virginia to give a Lincoln Day speech to the local Republican Women's Club. He told his audience that there were 205 communists in the State Department controlling American foreign policy. It was a blatant lie.
Yeah, he just made up a figure. In fact, he set up with a piece of paper and said, I hold in my hand a list of 205 communists in the State Department. There's in Wheeling, West Virginia. Senators would do these little speeches, and that's how they make money on the side. And he gave this, and out of the blue, he said this. Slow news day. Slow news day, it hit the wires and went all over the United States. And people were so geared up about communists in government, spies, and China, and Joe won, that they believed it.
Willard Edwards of the Chicago Tribune later said it was really a throwaway because if McCarthy had thought it was going to be a big speech, A, he wouldn't have given it in Wheeling, West Virginia, and B, he would have brought a bunch of reporters down who were right-wing reporters who were pals of his. So it was really a throwaway, but there was the charge.
The senator's accusations were published by newspapers across the country. McCarthy, elated by the attention, continued his speaking tour in Reno, Nevada, where Frank McCulloch, a young reporter for the Reno Gazette, was sent to meet him.
Came down off the plane, made clear that he'd known us for 50 years. We walked away from the plane with his arms around both our shoulders. We walked down a Reno street with his arm about our shoulders. And he discovered in the process of that walk that I'd been a Marine, and that delighted him. We became even closer buddies. Instinctively, socially, for a U.S. senator to treat a Bush League reporter like that is not. It isn't within the framework, and it made me very uneasy.
McCarthy was as easy with journalists as he was loose with the truth. In a subsequent radio interview, the number of communists in the State Department dwindled from 205 to 57.
We had the message from AP in which I think they quoted him as saying that he had in his hand a list of 205, and the story said communists, flatly, unequivocally. We began to try to examine him about, or question him about, why did you say 205 before and 57 now? I'll be honest with you, I don't remember what the answer was. It was a long argument, and we didn't get anywhere with it. And finally, it got to the point where at the end we were challenging him to produce this list of 57. He went through a great routine. He looked through his pockets. He looked in his briefcase, and he finally pronounced he'd lost it.
Yeah, not an important list at all. He lost it. As it turned out, we found out later when he held up that piece of paper, it was actually the betting odds for horse races that he was using to bet with his illegal bookie. So that's what it was, a racing sheet.
I remember when he came back from that Wheeling, West Virginia speech, he called me in and said, "Jack, I think I've hit the jackpot, but I don't really have much. Can you help me?" Well, I was anti-communist and he was my friend. And I said, "Sure, I'll help you. I'll see if we've got anything in the files." And I searched the files and I found one case that had been reported to us of a possible communist in the State Department.
Now, I got to be clear about this. The files, and that should be kind of scary. Remember mentioning the FBI was kind of this. The FBI was starting to gather files on people, and they were interviewing people. They were secretly wiretapping people. They started doing that, listening to their phone conversations, and they were compiling this information. Jack Anderson was a very well-known investigative reporter, and what was going on is that he was kind of the FBI befriended him, and they're giving this information as basically kind of, they wanted to implicate somebody. This would really change Anderson. He would go away. He would realize what's really going on. And soon the FBI would be investigating and wiretapping him. And during Watergate, Nixon would want him killed. Actually thought about assassinating him. Anderson would say that was a badge of honor. He survived, so that's why he became a badge of honor. But he gave these, and they're not the
Man rather high in the State Department. And I turned the raw filage over to Joe McCarthy, and I said, "You want to check this guy out? Maybe you've got something here, but check it out very carefully. This is the raw file." He read it verbatim on the Senate floor not long afterwards. And that's the last time I had anything to do with Joe McCarthy.
To Joe McCarthy, hunting communists was little more than a game in which he was the big winner.
He's a celebrity.
Around Washington, rumors of his drinking and gambling went unreported.
They would write him thousands of
I don't think this is an exaggeration. I think in probably, certainly no more than an hour, maybe an hour and a half, we had 8 drinks, 8 or 9 drinks. I could hardly get up to the table. And then everybody drank the same. All 3 of us drank bourbon and soda. And we all drank the same thing. I can't remember who paid the bill either. I suspect we did, but I don't remember.
And the gist of it was McCarthy was
The press of the day had one weakness that Joe McCarthy understood all too well. Their standards required them to be objective, to report exactly what was said, even if it was unsubstantiated.
He understood also another, maybe more important point.
So McCarthy made a statement, there are 57 communists. They'd write that down. They'd report it, and then it would stick. Even when they would do contractions, as they'll say a little bit later, and they'll say, "No, that wasn't true," it's already too late. That's back of the paper. It's front page. Remember, it's still up there. The great masses of the people will more easily fall victim to the big lie. You get that out there and it sticks. People are scared. We need to get those communists, and McCarthy will do it, even if he's lying and literally making up stuff.
That denials are never as dramatic as charges, and they're always 24 to 48 hours behind. The consequence was day after day, week after week, into the years, that the charges were A1. The denials were B7.
And that just happened today.
And he understood that, and he played it to the hill.
I remember that McCarthy was kind of a bully who was on your side if you were in the press. He knew the deadlines of the wire services. He knew the deadlines for all the major newspapers. He knew how photographers could take their pictures. And he knew that we had these big television cameras, film cameras, that couldn't stop when very easily. So he said something that would be just unheard of today. He said, boys, when I get to the important part, I'll rap on the side of the podium or lectern. And he did, and all the cameras were turned on, and they recorded just what Senator McCarthy wanted recorded, and then they turned off, and the film went back and was put on the air that night.
A Senate subcommittee investigates sensational charges by Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy couldn't have found a communist on May Day in Red Square in Moscow in a review held by Joe Stalin, which was true. He didn't have the faintest idea what a communist and didn't care. You know, that's the most incredible thing about that man. He had the mind of a man, he had the body of a man, but he had the soul of a little tiny child pulling the wings off a butterfly. None of this was serious to him.
One of the accused is John Stuart Service, now summoned home, and concerning whom Senator McCarthy says,
Mr. Chairman, today this man, John S. Service, is a ranking officer in the policy-making group of untouchables on duty.
One of McCarthy's targets was John Service, a promising young diplomat who had served in the Far East. When Mao Zedong's communist armies conquered China, Service reported that Mao posed no threat to the United States. To McCarthy, that meant that Service was a communist.
When you have a weak case, you've got to use weak kinds of evidence like guilt by association. You saw Owen Lattimore at a 4th of July reception at the American Embassy in Tokyo in 1935. What did he say? And so on. I mean, you can't prove that you're not something sometimes. It's very difficult. That time, with all the publicity, I had all sorts of trouble. I wanted to get term life insurance. No thanks. They wouldn't do it. As a man said to me, how do we know you're not going to jump out a window? Some other people had. We rented an apartment in New York and then found that the owner changed his mind. He wouldn't lease to us.
While others suffered under his attack, McCarthy continued to bask in the limelight.
At the entrance of the committee room, there were 2 doors. And just as we got outside, there was a photographer. He said, "Oh, Mr. Service, stand right there. I want to get another picture." And I was fed up. I mean, the pictures were just an awful nuisance during a hearing. They were all around in front of you and shooting up at you at the worst possible angles, and this and that. And I said, to hell with it. You've got hundreds of pictures. And my lawyer said, Jack, fine. Take it easy, guys. He might even get a good picture, and we got to be nice to him. So I stood there. And just as I stood there, a door flung open, and behind it was Senator McCarthy. The great Senator of the United States had put this photographer up to this cheap little silly trick so he could get a picture of him and me standing side by side. That's not, you're not serious when you engage in stuff like that.
What was a joke for Joe McCarthy was deadly serious for John Service. Despite McCarthy's failure to prove any of his charges, Service's career was destroyed. One of the country's most knowledgeable experts on China spent his last days in the Foreign Service stamping passports in Liverpool, England.
Even though some people didn't understand communism, the word was a threat. They outfoxed our President Roosevelt on Yalta, and it seemed that they got away with everything, the big piece of the pie. And so when McCarthy started the hearings, I was all for his going after the communists.
Here was Tail Gunner Joe talking about commies. Who are protecting the commies? The Democrats. And so the Democrat, the name liberal and Democrat became identified with pro-communist or communist sympathizer. Pinko was used constantly in those days.
You get the beginning of what is called McCarthyism because one party has really been in power too long. And much of the stuff that was surfaced as McCarthyism was an attempt of the Republican Party, which has been out for 20 years, to find an issue which would allow it back into power.
Plans have been discussed by leading members of the Communist Party and agents of the Soviet secret police to obtain blank American passports from the United States State Department, from communists employed in the State Department.
Making this all up.
But they say, oh, McCarthy, don't name them. Yes, I'll give that to Milwaukee's Daily Worker.
He was a demagogue, but he didn't look like a demagogue. He didn't act like a demagogue. He didn't speak like a demagogue. People, when they thought of demagogues, thought of Adolf Hitlers who held audiences in their sway. Joe McCarthy had this rumpled look, and he'd get up before the crowd, and he would whine, and he would stumble, and I think he would even deliberately shuffle through his papers as if searching diligently for the right name and the right fact. And he'd have to go back and repeat himself. And that was mistaken by a large number of people as sincerity. And he came across as a sincere person, and therefore as a believable person, and therefore as the most dangerous of demagogues.
Yeah.
Our function in coming back on the committee is not to expose and prosecute communists. Senator, would you like to hear this? It's about you.
Eventually, Tail Gunner Joe went too far. Wild and groundless allegations of communist infiltration of the United States Army cost him the support of even his most fervent allies.
And you don't have to have everybody looking at you all the time you're talking.
I'm the great pretender, pretending that I'm doing well. My need is such, I pretend too much. I'm lonely, but no one can tell.
During his anti-communist crusade, McCarthy ruined the lives of thousands of innocent people. But the man who had claimed the nation's undivided attention was ostracized and all but forgotten when he died of liver failure at the age of 48.
1957. His liver was supposedly 5 times the size of a normal adult male's liver. Okay, when you drink 3 to 4 fifths of whiskey a day, you'll blow your liver up. So don't. There, that is my message. You know, filters out the toxins. Alcohol's toxic to the human body, and it can filter a lot, but eventually it just started expanding. So cirrhosis of the liver, quit functioning. He drank himself to death. But here's why he really failed. It's not that he went too far. It's this. Just so you know, who was elected president in 53? Or 52, who became president? Who? Eisenhower. And what party was Eisenhower? And McCarthy didn't know when to quit. He kept attacking Eisenhower, saying that his army was full of communists. His State Department was full of communists. Everyone got that? He kept attacking Eisenhower. And all the Republicans dropped their support for him. His own party's like, quit. Now we're in charge. But he's the one that all the people surrounding him like he was a celebrity. And so in 54, when they foolishly attacked the army with just this ludicrous claims, they actually cut out pictures of generals and pasted them onto pictures of known communists. You can see the marks where they cut. The scale was all wrong. It was just clearly a joke. In fact, it's kind of interesting about this. His lead attorney was a guy named Roy Cohn. And his connection to the current president now. It's kind of amazing how these people just kind of cycle around. Roy Cohn, President Trump considers McCarthy's lead attorney, Roy Cohn, is one of his biggest mentors. So it's kind of interesting how history, you know, we just kind of get this, they keep cycling around. We get the same people. Okay, so that's McCarthy, but it's not like it ended. The most dangerous time ended, but this cold, yeah, it's not hilarious. This Cold War continued. So he went to advertisement. This is an advertisement in the early 1950s. This is for tissues, for Scott tissues. And as we had, yeah, if you don't have good paper towels, communists grow like the plague. And then there was always this talk about infiltration of radical ideas into the schoolhouse. And see the little red schoolhouse full of commies. And to this day, people say that that's going on in schools. To this day, in fact, I was asked, I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for a long time. And since everybody went to school, they know all about teaching. I always think that's kind of funny. But one guy said to me, so in schools, I heard that you're teaching everyone to become Muslims. And do you want to know my response?
Yes.
Of course we are. But it's like, where do you hear that? Oh, I know where they hear that. But that was true, huh? And so, now here's a good cartoon. Here is the hysteria. This is a Herblock cartoon. And dumping water on this fire. What's the fire? The Statue of Liberty. To get social unity, and then I think you see it in the next picture. Even our fairs and carnivals. There's bumper cars, bears. Soviet bears. Communism. Bumper cars. Bees. Okay, with that. So, it's no coincidence that all of this leads right to American involvement in the Korean War. Less than 5 years after World War II ending, the United States will be involved in a full-scale land war in Asia. In a place most people could not find, with two countries that were not created until 1949. So, here's Korea. It was a Japanese colony that brutally treated it. A lot of animosity to this day. And after World War II, they did like they did in Germany. They literally just took the 38th parallel and said the Soviets will occupy here, so there's government, the US here, and they'll be unified. But in 49, especially after the Berlin era, the realization hit, we're not going to come to an agreement, so they created two countries. In the north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung, whose great-grandson is now the head of Korea today. And they just exploded a secret weapon yesterday. So things are escalating again. But they want you to know it's a weapon. They just don't know. They don't want you to know what kind of weapon.
It's a pig with a sword taped to its back.
You know, that could be. But I'm guessing it involves something that involves many more kilotons. And so with that, yeah, pigs no more than 2 or 3 kilotons. Kim Il-sung was a hard-nosed guerrilla fighter. He had fought the Japanese. He had been trained by the Soviet Union. When they placed him there, they had placed the real deal. He was a credible guerrilla fighter against the Japanese. He was given equipment. He had credibility. He was the real deal. I'm not saying he wasn't a brutal, horrible dictator, but he was the real deal. He was not just put in there. Unlike Syngman Rhee, who the United States put in South Korea, installed him to create a democracy, but he created a brutal dictatorship. He had no real following in Korea. He was anti-Japanese, but he had spent most of his life outside of Korea. So he had nobody inside Korea who was really allied with him. It was a relatively weak dictatorship. He didn't have an army, or a very little army, very poorly equipped. The real deal up here, with over 100 Soviet T-34 tanks with 85mm guns. Very good tanks. And Kim Il-sung, there wasn't really much of a warning. On June 25th, 1950, he decided to unify the North and the South. They attacked the South, brushed aside the tiny South Korean army, took Seoul in a week, and advanced south very quickly. In fact, it looked like the South would fall like this. But things are different now in 1950. And you can imagine how the Truman administration were meeting in Blair House because they're remodeling the White House. They literally gutted the White House. You see the White House today, if you're during the Truman administration. The outside remained, but inside they removed the entire inside and rebuilt the entire thing. So if you take a tour of that, it's all been gutted. It might have many of the same like tapestry and paintings from before, but it's all made during this time. Well, they decided to keep the old facade though. They panicked, and their first thought was, we will be blamed for this. We will be blamed for losing South Korea, just like we took a beating over China. And think Truman Doctrine thinking. So Truman would announce, did not ask Congress. So by definition, they violated the Constitution and Congress let them do it. Why did Congress let them do it? They were scared too. Everybody's scared. He committed troops. There's him announcing he committed troops. And think about the Truman Doctrine. The reason he justified it, he made the statement, we're defending a democracy in South Korea, even though they weren't a democracy. But most people couldn't have found South Korea on a map, let alone knew what kind of government they were. But according to Truman Doctrine thinking, it's not Kim Il-sung in charge, who's in charge? And so it's to fight him. And after those 2 shocks of 49 and the growth of McCarthyism, think about it. February, he gave that speech, June the attack. That's only 4 months. A little bit over 4 months, and this hysteria is just exploding. And Truman and the Democrats are running scared. So they're going to show they're tough. And he didn't want to say it was a war. Remember, the Soviets just exploded a nuclear weapon. They want people to think, next thing you know, there'll be waves of Soviet bombers, if they exist, dropping atomic bombs. And so they said, is it a conflict? Is it a brush fire war? They made all these things because he wouldn't say war. Finally, a reporter said, is it a police action? And Truman said, yes, it's a police action. And why put question marks there is nobody even knows what that means. Are we going to go arrest the North Koreans? It made no sense. But this shows how many of these decisions were pretty absurd. We tried to tone down it was a war that almost 50,000 Americans and 2 million Koreans are going to die. And the United States said this was blatant aggression by North Korea, which it was. And so they went to what was the body created, formalized at Yalta? The what? And they went to the Security Council. Did anyone catch? No one caught it. I liked it untied. The untied nation. I didn't catch the tied, so I left it. All right, so the Security Council makes all the decisions. And they wanted the Security Council to say this is an act of aggression and member states should send troops. But who normally would have vetoed this? But the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council because the United States would not allow Mao Zedong. And that's how we know for a fact that Stalin did not know that Kim Il-sung was going to attack. This was not, Stalin did not want this.
So they couldn't veto because they weren't like participants?
Yes. And so the United Nations said that this was an act of aggression and we would fight, all the troops to fight. That is the UN flag over the front lines in Korea in 1953. And if you ever see the DMZ today, UN flag. All right, so tonight or tomorrow, we're going to do the war, do the greatest commercial ever in history of all advertising. Sorry, the second greatest commercial. Next week, we'll do the greatest commercial. Oh, no, we might watch a movie. I've decided. It's about time you guys sit down. Yeah, let's have a seat.
So there's this, and it's like you can get a scholarship for writing a paper at Bush State, and you have to write papers on the Korean War, and they give you extra points if your family was in the Korean War. So why would they pick the Korean War over? Why is it so important?
I don't know why. Yeah, it's the American Legion that has it. Yeah, the American Legion straight out what we want. I wonder if they just have so they might go World War II. Yeah.
Like there's no big importance. So.
No more than any other reports. I think they probably just run so they're not the same for every year. Yeah, good luck on that. Yes. Huh? That brainstorm outline the thesis on that.
You know,
So you would have
sure. And then the DB.
Yeah.
I never said.
Oh, yeah. So let me find it. I put it open. Yeah, you did well.
Okay. I just want to know to like prepare for the next one. You know what I mean?
I think the only I can remember is
Yeah.
Okay.
You need a little bit more like a 24
I feel like it's probably not gonna be high hours. My bed's pretty high She's my, okay.
Probably got you
Just
could
tell
work.
them that
You
they
could work.
feel it. Why would
Wait! Okay, look around the room. Why? Do you want different seats?
Yes.
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 You don't want to change?
No. I'm blind. Like, I can't wear my glasses.
Well, you can stay there. I'll tell you what. If I'll give you 5 minutes. If you want to change seats with somebody, I'll let you rotate, move around. I got bored of you.
I know. Like, get up. You guys want to go?
Yeah, all of you in back. Skylar's not moving. I'm moving you outside. So stand right there. I want your face against the door. By the way, the Mueller report has come out. It's pretty entertaining. It is redacted. It's kind of funny. You know, bits and pieces. Look, actually, no. I was expecting like all black line, like and then the, or no, there'll be the, and then and. Yeah, that's what I thought, but. But like, I'll give you an example. That's a few things redacted. The big thing is because there are ongoing investigations, and since they involve money laundering, which appears to be a big issue, they're probably going to redact those. But there are some pretty big things in there. It's actually
Well, and they redacted any like different source than one.
well, that we don't know. Maybe. But there's some pretty big information there. All right, so a couple things in real fast. And the phone didn't move. They were trying to do that to the tablecloth. Yeah, we're in college. We tried to do that once. And needless to say, it worked perfect. It's actually really funny. Huh?
What here?
You know, my answer would be, not old. I wish you guys knew. All right, so, which unfortunately seems to be the answer of a lot of people. And since I don't have children. Okay. So we got a little bit left to finish up the video, and you're watching that again. I remember it being pretty, and it was. And by the way, wasn't that well done? I'm in kind of awe how well done that is. So you have a little bit left to watch of this, and it goes a little bit more about what happened at the end of the war, a little bit about the bomb. It does miss a couple things about it. It's really focusing on a lot of decisions amongst Japan, and there was a complex issues going on, but the war was getting absolutely horrific. Who was Togo, by the way? He was foreign minister. What did he want? Peace. Yeah, peace with some kind of terms, which he never decided on. Who is Anami? Yeah, minister of war, and what did he want? Basically, fight to win. Okay, they didn't want everyone to die. They still thought they could get that one big battle and force the Americans to do what? Super peace. Yeah, super peace. So they weren't all trying to commit suicide, even though that might have been the net goal. What happened to the main part of the Japanese fleet at Okinawa? So, what did they do? What was the plan for the Japanese fleet? What are we doing here? Yeah.
It was just meant to, like, last ditch suicide effort.
Yeah, they gave them just enough oil to get from Tokyo down to Okinawa, and the whole plan was to sacrifice the entire Japanese fleet. And what happened before they ever got there?
Planes.
Yeah, American carrier planes sunk almost all of them, killed thousands of Japanese sailors, but fighter planes escorted them, so that left the American fleet open to what? How many American ships were sunk by kamikazes?
30.
Yeah, 30 ships were sunk. A little off. Yeah. 30 ships. And it was, oh, I should add this down. I forgot to say this yesterday. They kept that secret from the American public. They did not let Americans know how awful kamikazes were, because that would have terrified them. And why did they do that?
Because war is very anti-war.
Yeah, that part of it is the reality of war is anti-war. But the other thing is this. They had to gear the American public that what sacrifice might be necessary. An invasion. And they didn't want them to know how truly awful it was. In 1944, when right after D-Day, and American tanks started running up against German tanks, American tanks were just slaughtered. And they kept that secret from the American public too. They didn't want people to know that we're producing tanks that were inferior. Fortunately, we produced a lot of them. So they overwhelmed the rickety German tanks, who were powerful but would break down.
When did the kamikazes come up?
They heard about them right after the Philippines, but they didn't realize until.
And be a leader. Our administration and sharing many of the same advisors.
July 1945.
Startling story in July of 1945. And very invasion beaches were. These intercepts were so secret that no one who saw them, including the president.
I think it is.
Sorry.
This
Decisions and be a leader.
Here we go.
Hoping to avoid what he called an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the
30
other.
seconds and I can't get it.
Truman approved only the Kyushu landing, and only after all the chiefs endorsed it.
Operation Olympus.
He postponed a decision on invading
And
Tokyo.
so there are very elaborate plans for this. And then the plans on Tokyo are pretty big on both sides.
Only 2 weeks after committing himself to a fight to the finish, the emperor summoned his war cabinet.
We did see this, didn't we?
It was June 22nd, the day Okinawa fell to the Americans.
The emperor's conference with this inner cabinet was indeed a critical moment and extremely unusual in the nature of Japanese politics, because the emperor, in fact, took the lead, indicated that he wanted the government to actively pursue a diplomatic option, mediating an end to the war, not surrendering, mediating an end to the war that would be acceptable to Japan.
The diplomatic option also had to be acceptable both to General Anami, who led the military faction in the war cabinet, and to Foreign Minister Togo, who led an emerging peace faction. The emperor had been warned the Soviet Union might enter the war against Japan. Nonetheless, the war cabinet decided to ask the Soviet Union to mediate.
For military, I think it is very important to keep the Soviet out of the war. They were quite aware that they could not afford to have a two-front war. And Togo thought that Moscow approach, I think, is crucial to terminate the war.
There was no decision on what peace terms Japan might offer.
So they're going to go to the Soviet Union. They don't know that the Soviet Union has already promised. They'll go into the war 3 months after Germany surrendered.
As Hirohito made overtures to the Soviets, Truman set off to meet their leader, Joseph Stalin. He went to the Berlin suburb of Potsdam to discuss post-war Europe with Allied leaders.
Does anybody know what teacher who is a capital, whose Her teacher's father was there as part of the Allied Armor Brigade that was there. Who? What did you say? Mr. Long. Mr. Long's dad was part of the 2nd Armored Division. He was there. And he talked those stories about how they had pictures of the big three, and that Churchill, Stalin, and FDR. Because they had them all made before they realized, or before they knew that Roosevelt was died. So they had hastily put up little pictures of Truman over Roosevelt, which is kind of,
And to see that Stalin kept a promise to enter the war against Japan after Germany was defeated.
Yeah, they promised in Yalta.
The Allies had promised Stalin territorial concessions if he entered the war. Stalin told Truman he would on August 15th. Truman's diary entry that night read, "Feeny Japs when that comes about."
What does that mean? But he also wrote,
In Potsdam, Truman received word from the director of the Manhattan Project. The atom bomb had been tested successfully at Alamogordo, New Mexico. "Believe Japs will fold up before Russia comes in," he wrote. "I'm sure they will when Manhattan appears over their homeland."
So he's already saying, boy, I hope we get them out before August 15th. Because that's when the Japanese said, or the Russians said they're going to enter the war. So let's hope the Japanese are over once Manhattan. Now we say that's the Trinity Bomb. And one more thing. Stalin said August 15th. Who in here believes Stalin? Rule 1, if Stalin tells you something, doubt it. What day did Germany surrender? May 8th, 1945. What is exactly 3 months after August 8th? Did the U.S. spot that? August 15th day?
Within days after these optimistic diary entries, intelligence from intercepted Japanese military cables, called Ultra, was alarming. In June, the invasion planners projected 3 Japanese divisions in southern Kyushu. By July, there was evidence of 9 divisions, triple the number in just 1 month.
Ultra told a startling story in July of 1945. Japanese units were moving into southern Kyushu at an alarming rate. It was as if the very invasion beaches were magnets, drawing the Japanese forces to those places where the Americans would have to land and fight their way ashore. It was very clear from the messages that the Japanese intended to fight to the bitter end.
These intercepts were so secret that no one who saw them, including the president, was supposed to write about them. There is some evidence Truman saw the intercept dated July 25th.
With Truman, we have this extraordinary entry in his diary on the 25th of July, 1945, where he talks about meeting in the morning with General Marshall and British Admiral Mountbatten, and they talked about the tactical and political situation. Well, there's no place in the world that U.S. forces are engaged in a tactical battle on the 25th of July. It seems pretty clear to me that he must be talking about the intercepts. And what Truman is doing with that entry is leaving a cryptic message to us down through the years. I saw, I saw, I saw.
That happened to be the night Secretary of War Henry Stimson sent a wire authorizing the use of the atomic bomb.
There was no reason not to do it. It made good sense, and it was not a weighty matter. In the framework of mid-1945 for Truman and those around him, the answer was self-evident. Nobody around him had any sustained and serious doubts about using the bomb.
And I should add, when Stimson sent that message, okay, that Truman never made that order because he didn't have to. Of course, they were going to use it. He never made the order to use napalm. He never made the order, or Roosevelt didn't make an order like that. They never made an order about firebombing. Of course, they were going to use it. Stimson just simply sent the order, and it wasn't even an order like, okay, You're going to drop the bomb. No, all it said was, okay, the bombs will arrive by cruiser, small ships, pieces of it, and as soon as you get it, you can use it. We're just authorizing the use of a weapon. It's all it was.
They didn't specify any cities.
Not at all. Now, the Air Force had been thinking about this and knowing there might be a bomb that could blow up a city, so they were making contingency plans when they got the bomb. In fact, there was one city, big city, they hadn't really firebombed. So they could know what the damage the bomb did. And after the war, President Truman's going to go out of his way to make it seem like he made a very careful and calculated decision. And it was not hastily made. That was for post-war politics. During the war, we're going to use it. But also, don't forget, that's a key point. Why not? Look what they've been doing to Tokyo. How is that different? To every city there. To their mind, they know the big bomb. How's that different? One plane, 350 planes. What's the difference? Huge. I know, but maybe not in 45.
It was the implementation of a long-run assumption rooted in the FDR administration and sharing many of the same advisors.
There is no way that any American president, faced with the expenditures that's been put into the project, faced with the casualties in the Pacific, could not have used that bomb. What would have come out later if all of a sudden the invasion went in and had all these casualties, and the American public found out later that, well, we had this super bomb, but we didn't want to use it because we thought we were going to kill too many Japanese. You just couldn't make that decision.
Nobody knew for sure what it would take to get the Japanese to yield. We're going to do everything we have been doing, and we're going to add the Soviets, and we're going to add the bomb, and we're going to add the invasion, and hope that at some point in this process, the Japanese crack and surrender.
Truman was advised he might save American lives if he dropped the demand for unconditional surrender and allowed Japan to keep the emperor.
This is really important.
The idea had originated with Joseph Grew, former ambassador to Japan, now the Undersecretary of State. Secretary of War Henry Stimson also favored this conditional surrender. Truman had sailed to Europe with Stimson's draft of a warning the Allies would give Japan. He recommended the emperor remain as a constitutional monarch like the King of England. But it was James Burns, the Secretary of State, who had Truman's ear aboard ship. The Nazis had surrendered unconditionally, and he believed Americans would demand the same of Hirohito.
James Burns.
Burns is the most savvy politician in the administration. He was a leader of the Senate at the time that Truman was really a junior senator. He was a mentor to Truman. Burns is a kind of person who worried about the electorate, who worried about domestic politics. It didn't take great perception to read the polls of early June 1945 and discover that most Americans hated the emperor system, wanted the destruction of both Hirohito and the system, and saw this as responsible for the war.
Truman sided with Burns. If at Potsdam he had allowed Japan to keep the emperor, many historians have argued, Japan might have surrendered before the atomic bomb was dropped. Intercepts, codenamed Magic, of the exchange between Foreign Minister Togo in Tokyo and Japan's ambassador in Moscow, Naotake Sato, tell a different story.
Ambassador Sato is very clear. The best you're going to get out of this is what he calls unconditional surrender, and then he thinks better of that and refines it to mean, of course, we would retain the imperial institution, but it would still be a surrender, and this is the best you're going to get.
And all he gets back in response to that is, no, 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 we can't accept anything like unconditional surrender, and certainly not simply a modification to provide for a guarantee of the imperial institution. Foreign Minister Togo says that in the name of the Japanese government. That's all enshrined in black and white in the Magic Diplomatic Summary of July 22nd, 1945. in my view, it leaves no reasonable room for doubt that simply offering a promise about the imperial institution would have secured the surrender of Japan.
That is potentially true. There's a lot
The Potsdam Declaration, issued July 26, 1945, was an ultimatum calling on Japan to surrender unconditionally and without delay, or risk prompt and utter destruction. It also offered various terms for Japan to rejoin the family of nations. It was signed by the Allies in the war against Japan, but not by the Soviet Union, which had not yet declared war. When the ultimatum arrived in Tokyo, Japan's Prime Minister, Admiral Kentaro Suzuki, said the government intended to ignore it.
Since the Soviet Union's name did not appear as one of the countries that had signed the Potsdam Declaration, why don't we wait for their final word with regard to whether or not they can mediate?
When the Potsdam Declaration was issued,
I got one thing to add to that. So what he's talking about was they were just slightly misleading the I just read about this. Is that when the about the Soviets, they chose not to respond to that message. Not ignore, not respond. And there was a translation issue. What not respond meant is we're waiting then for news on our message. But the Americans took that as they're ignoring us. And that really was a translation issue about there wasn't an English word for essentially, we're not going to respond until we hear basically the rest of the message is the way they looked at it. And so that was a translation issue. And the whole thing about they said no to the surrender with keeping their emperor, that is highly debated. If whether or not that what they really, they said, no, we're not going to do that, but we want a word that's not the word surrender. Then we keep our emperors and fight.
within the inner sanctum of the Japanese government, even what we regard as the moderates deemed the Potsdam Declaration as a sign of weakening American will. That we had already offered all these terms before the first drop of blood was shed in the invasion. And they were fortified in the belief that they should just press on.
The Potsdam Declaration had said, "We shall brook no delay." By August 5th, after 9 days, Japan had not officially responded. Hirohito did not press his government to accept it. Instead, he worried about how to preserve the imperial regalia, emblems of the legitimacy of his rule. The sacred mirror, symbol of the sun goddess, was worshipped at the grand shrine at Ise. The sacred sword, symbol of bravery, was preserved at the Atsuta shrine in Nagoya City. The sacred curved jewel, symbol of affection, was enshrined at the imperial palace. The emperor wanted all of them at the palace for protection.
Here's a man who ought to be thinking about his children, as he called them, his people. Instead, his insiders say he was concerned about the insignia and symbols of office. All the things that gave him, in a sense, sovereignty and invested him with power.
He had no connection to the people.
He was more concerned about the destruction of his power than the destruction of his country.
On August 6th, the day an atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima, Hirohito was still waiting for a response from Moscow. It was a response that Ambassador Sato had said would never come.
It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
General Marshall, the advocate of invasion, was having second thoughts. In July, the intercepts identified 9 divisions protecting Kyushu. On August 6th, they identified 13. For Marshall, it was a preview of hell.
Were they all straight?
The landings at Normandy had been costly, but successful. Marshall began to question if the invasion plans for Japan would succeed. He asked General Douglas MacArthur, who was to command the invasion, to consider moving the landing to northern Japan.
Just imagine you're George Marshall, and on the eve of the Normandy invasion, you suddenly tell Dwight Eisenhower, hey, don't invade Normandy. Why don't we reschedule the whole thing and invade Norway, where the German defenses are weaker? Well, I mean, the mind boggles because of all of the work, all of the effort, all of the planning that's gone into this. Yet this is really, in effect, what Marshall is saying to MacArthur in August of 1945.
The warning had been raised by his own intelligence officer, yet MacArthur downplayed it. Douglas MacArthur was determined to lead the greatest invasion in the history of warfare. One way to make an invasion possible, Marshall thought, would be to destroy beach defenses with atomic bombs. The Manhattan Project informed him at least 7 would be ready by November 1st.
Marshall is now planning to use atomic bombs really as tactical support weapons against the Japanese beach defenses to precede the landing by the American units, almost as if it were naval gunfire support.
The scientists had calculated that anybody who'd be killed by radiation would have already been killed by a rock or blast or heat. You read the contemporary planning documents and you see that there's no appreciation of the potential danger of immediate or lingering radiation.
This would have happened. The invaders of the land of the gods would have entered the world of the dead on both sides.
I should add, they knew about radiation. They knew about the radiation from the bombs. In fact, a scientist had died because of radiation. They called it tickling the dragon when they were going to Los Alamos. He had died of radiation poisoning, but they did not know about fallout. And fallout is something different and dirty. You know what fallout is? The bomb hits, it's the reaction with the soil. And the soil is brought up in this cloud and it leaves a highly irradiated soil and basically particles that could spread for miles. So when I was a youth growing up, and the thought was that they're going to blow up around Great Falls and all the nuclear missiles there, it'd be the fallout that would kill them. Would have killed them. It was the fallout that made milk poisonous in Utah for 15 years.
Just before midnight on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Fearing the atomic bomb would end the war before he entered, Stalin advanced the date. The Red Army launched the largest land operation of the Pacific War against the Japanese in Manchuria.
Arguably the largest land operation.
At the same time, U.S. forces were readying a second atomic bomb.
The colors of often is more orange than that, but yeah. They're all shiny.
For 3 days after the Hiroshima bombing, the Japanese government had not met. With the hope for Soviet mediation shattered, the War Cabinet gathered at 10:30 a.m. on August 9th to discuss the Potsdam Declaration.
So did you catch the timing on that? The atomic bomb was dropped on the 6th, and they didn't even realize the import of that bomb. Part of the reason was the city was destroyed and they couldn't get information there, but part of it was, well, we've already had these other cities destroyed. What they met about was the Potsdam Declaration, but the big thing was the Soviets.
Foreign Minister Togo led the peace faction, urging acceptance, with one condition: preserving the emperor, although stripped of his powers.
What prompted Peace Party is a profound fear that the Soviet influence, if allowed to continue, then that would lead to the end of the monarchical system.
The inevitable has come, said General Anami, who feared a two-front war. Yet Anami and the militarists, still confident in Ketsugo, favored adding 3 additional conditions. There would be no occupation. The Japanese military would disarm itself, and the military would try its own war criminals.
They really lack reality picture. They, it's rather amazing that they were audacious enough to hammer out such unrealistic 3 conditions attached to the preservation of the imperial throne.
Anami told the War Cabinet he was certain America only had 1 atomic bomb. It was at that time, just before 1 p.m. on August 9th, that word reached the meeting a second bomb had hit Nagasaki.
They have 2, they must have many.
The War Cabinet was divided over surrender. The full cabinet then met. It too was divided. Only the emperor could break the deadlock. He met first with his principal advisor, Marquis Koichi Kido.
And Kido had very important meeting with Emperor that afternoon that lasted for a long time, unusually long time. That meant they met substantial issues. Emperor resisted to accept Togo's narrowest definition and expanded it to include Emperor's political rule. In other words, that one condition should not be merely preservation of the imperial house, but the preservation of Emperor's status within the national law. He wanted actual power.
The emperor wanted the powers he then enjoyed, the powers granted his grandfather under the Constitution of 1868. When the emperor's inner circle met with him that night, Baron Hiranuma, a Shinto fundamentalist, tried to further solidify the emperor's powers.
Hiranuma's argument was the Constitution was irrelevant. The imperial line predated the Meiji Constitution of 1868. The origin of Japan was the origin of the imperial house, and that was a divine event because the imperial family descended from the gods long before any constitution existed. It was irrelevant to discuss the emperor's prerogatives in terms of legal arrangements. The emperor transcended those worldly forms. He was a transcendent being.
The emperor broke the deadlock. Japan sent word to Washington. It accepted the Potsdam Declaration with one condition, that it did not prejudice the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. These prerogatives would give the emperor the power to prevent the U.S. from demilitarizing and democratizing Japan. This was not the powerless symbolic emperor like the King of England that Togo and some of Truman's advisors had imagined. Japan's response to the Potsdam Declaration arrived in Washington August 10th. Even after 2 atomic bombs, no one expected surrender so soon. Secretary of War Stimson dropped vacation plans to attend a cabinet meeting.
Stimson took the lead. He urged Truman to accept the Japanese offer. Stimson told Truman that if we don't use the emperor to obtain an organized capitulation of Japanese armed forces, we could be facing a score of Iwo Jimas or Okinawas across the Asian continent, and Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And that's an analogy to a casualty figure somewhere between 600,000 and almost 1 million. And Stimson isn't even talking about the home islands.
Truman told his cabinet that telegrams he had already received were overwhelmingly against accepting Japan's offer.
Telegrams from American citizens.
To Secretary of State Burns, these expressions of public opinion mattered.
Burns said that this will mean the crucifixion of the president. Wonderfully dramatic metaphor. That is, if the president accedes to retaining the imperial system and presumably the emperor, he, the president, is going to be destroyed at home. This is the fear of the backlash.
Burns got support from an unexpected quarter. Retaining the emperor had been the idea of Undersecretary of State Joseph Grew and Japan experts in the State Department, including Joseph Ballantyne. They were derided by some as emperor worshippers, but they knew what Baron Hiranuma meant by imperial prerogatives.
Ballantyne immediately, he said, oh, this is a bad news. This is imperial prerogatives. That means you are going to maintain the source of Japanese militarism. That would be in contradiction with basic objectives of the United States.
Burns was in a tough position. To reject Japan's offer might prolong the war and give the Soviets a foothold in Japan and a role in the occupation. The response Burns drafted for Truman sidestepped the fate of the emperor, but made it clear he would not be in charge. From the moment of surrender, it read, "The authority of the emperor and the Japanese government shall be subject to the supreme commander allied powers."
So there'll still be an emperor. We accepted that term. It was clever.
When Burns' response arrived in Japan, the war cabinet was once again split. For 3 rancorous days, General Anami led those opposing surrender. On August 14th, the emperor intervened once again and imposed his will. "It is my belief," he said with sadness, "that continuation of the war promises nothing but additional destruction." Just before midnight, he recorded a surrender message.
So, August 14th,
Within the hour, junior officers launched a coup d'etat with the murder of 2 leaders of the palace guard. The rebels ransacked the imperial palace, hoping to destroy the surrender message. They burned the homes of Prime Minister Suzuki and Baron Hiranuma, calling them pro-American traitors.
So we got that there was an attempted coup by junior officers. They're going to keep the surrender from happening.
General Anami never condemned the coup, but he never backed it.
Guess where this is going?
Without his support, it was doomed. Anami's last act was that of a proud Japanese warrior who had fought his battle and lost.
So, by not backing it, the coup didn't survive and it fails.
And I mean, ritual suicide, I think, was very, very important symbolic meaning because this is the end of imperial army. So that's a clean break. This is the end of the army.
That was a big deal. When he committed suicide, it's like, okay, but now he calls and told the army, okay, and then this. Here it is.
In a radio broadcast at noon on August 15th, Japanese people heard something they had never heard before. Their emperor's voice.
They never heard him speak. Do you wonder why don't worry about his medal? People had no connection.
He never mentioned defeat or surrender.
In essence, what the emperor says is, things didn't quite go our way. The situation did not develop to our advantage. I mean, this is one of the classic understatements in world history. When he looks around at this ruined empire, well, it didn't quite go as we expected. Well, okay, sure we didn't.
This is totally devoid of personal responsibility or responsibility of Japan causing that war.
He also specifically singles out the atomic bomb as being a reason for the surrender, saying that the Americans are so unusually cruel and savage that to spare humanity from further such barbarities, I will end the war.
No one had a monopoly on cruelty.
The emperor, who had worried about a rebellion from his subjects, helped ensure his position by posing as their savior.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Word of the Japanese surrender would soon reach anxious American forces poised for the invasion.
You couldn't believe how happy we were. It was like getting a death sentence revoked, you know, it was wonderful.
The emperor directed a special surrender message to his armed forces. He never mentioned the bomb, but stressed the Soviet entry into the war.
From the standpoint of securing their compliance, Soviet intervention was a far, far more potent argument. The prospect of massive Soviet armies sweeping down across Asia and confronting them was a very real and intimidating prospect.
I think the best explanation of why the Japanese surrender is it's because a whole series of shocks that occur. Both bombs were important. And I think that the Russian invasion also is very important. Hard to weight which are more important, but I think it's worth saying that there's a certain equality there, that they are both very important.
In explaining Japan's defeat, Hirohito wrote to his son, "Our military men placed too much weight on spirit and forgot about science." His wife, Empress Nagako, seemed to agree. A few days after the surrender, she wrote, "Every day from morning to night, B-29s, naval bombers, and fighters freely fly over the palace, making an enormous noise. As I sit at my desk writing and look up at the sky, countless numbers are passing over. Unfortunately," she added, "the B-29 is a splendid plane."
Yeah, 2 air carrier task forces are kind of going up and down the coast, Bob.
There's more on the victory in the Pacific and American experience online. Screen on it.
It does cover a lot. So the last firebombing raid was on its way. 180 bombers were on their way to Kobe and Osaka. And there were rumors, and they heard intelligence pick up the Japanese might surrender at midnight. But a decision was made to drop that bomb, so they were going really early in the morning. And so they were on their way. Now, I don't see any of this written down. Okay. find it. And then they were on their way, 180 bombers, and they were waiting, all ready to go. And they could see Mount Fuji, they could see the coastline, they were going to firebomb. They were literally on their way, and they got that message within sight. If the message to Japanese surrender would have been just a little bit later, they would have firebombed. They were on their way. They would have got to the point where basically it would soon be known as a fail-safe line. They couldn't go back. So they were literally inside, they would turn back and fly back to Guam. That's where their bases were. So that was the last firebombing raid. And it was on the way. So don't think about just the atomic bomb. And they do a pretty good job. We should talk about the atomic bombs. And they don't talk about one more thing. The submarines did cut off the food and fuel. They had about a month of food reserves left. They had a month of food reserves left when the first atomic bomb was dropped. And they had, I'm sorry, not a month, other way around. I'm sorry. They had a month of oil reserves left and 3 months of food reserves. They were out of food, out of oil. And so there's no human way they could have fought that war. And so they probably would have surrendered. The whole issue about the emperor, I mean, that was spiraling to, you can see the line to eventually they would give up the emperor. But yeah, invasion might not have happened. They talked about all those divisions. We know they were way under strength. They were not fully strength. They were filled up with basically young boys and old men, a lot of them. Even my age, so way too old to be effective at all. And then anywhere from 10 to 13 years old. But they did have thousands of little basically rafts with little outboard engines on that they were going to use to bring landing craft. They mentioned that in the video about strapping satchel charges, basically little bits of plastic explosive with a fuse they could pull and strap it to people's bellies, and they run under tanks or other armored vehicles. So they planned this. Now, probably going to quit, but we don't know. We really don't know. And the big thing was, they don't also talk about the fear of the Soviets in there, which is fine, because it talks about the war. Boy, you can tell the Japanese feared them. Everybody feared the Soviets. Operation Uranus, that was the attack on them. That's what the Soviets codenamed that attack. And it was unbelievable. They conquered all of Manchuria, which is a massive place, bigger than Helena. It's huge. They conquered that in less than a week. It was the fastest military operation, the fastest advance by any army in the history of armed warfare, ever. Now, part of it was the Chinese or the Japanese soldiers up there. They pulled out a lot of their heavy equipment to try to get to Japan, and their morale broke. Once the Soviets attacked, we're done. And the Soviets did not quit. They did not quit that offensive until about August 21st. The war was over, but they kept going. They were going to get as much land as possible. And so they advanced well into Korea and kept going. They were going to try to get off Korea. They had landing craft. They tried to take much of the Kuril Islands, and they were attacking here. And they had plans to skip across to Hokkaido and take the northernmost island. Knowing the way the Soviets did it, there was no hesitation. The Americans would spend months planning operations. The Soviets were going. Yes, they planned this operation, but the stories about them against the Germans, there'd be a river, and they get to like the Dnieper River in Russia, this 1.5 mile wide river, and they wouldn't even wait for it. They'd send men across, just basically floating on logs, get them across and take a bridgehead. The Soviets did not hesitate. Of course, they were given the order, cross the river, we'll shoot you. So they figured out a way to cross the river. That's one thing about totalitarian dictatorships. They have that, I guess that's what we call an advantage. Okay, so I hope I like how they talk about that, talk about the enemy. It does a good job. They would formally surrender the next month on what? Battleship.
USS.
The Missouri. A battleship built during the war. And where is the Missouri today? I mentioned this a lot. Yeah. About 500 yards from the Arizona Memorial. About 500 yards. Has anyone been to one? Anyone else? Field trip? Yeah, we got about $2,000 left in our field trip budget for the entire school.
So that's enough to pay
Don't
for
tell me, but people know that they get rid of that quick. So I think we get a yellow school bus. Big cross, we just put some balloons on the side for amphibians. I'll let you guys all meet you there. All right, so, okay. So then I'll hand back the stuff tomorrow. People are doing well on that. I will make a couple changes on that, but I thought that's a good way to start with Pearl Harbor, a little bit more on Midway. You guys read about that. This fighting on Okinawa will get you an idea of what the fighting was like. And the fighting was like that everywhere. So we got a choice. Do you want a test on this? A little quiz, something. You got something. Or would you rather? Let me think about it. Yeah, we didn't watch the movie Pearl Harbor.
Give us a test.
Yeah, I know. No. Test us. 3 out of 5 day test. Yes, the movie is that bad.
Give us a take-home.
Yeah. I'll give you a take-home test. All right, we'll have a little quiz. But I'll take a big one on this, and we gotta do a couple different things. But we did pick assassinations and 20 gangsters. Do you want to do more? I don't want to do another war. Especially after watching what happened in Okinawa, I got to take a little break. But do you want gangsters or assassination? Assassinations. Okay. Huh? What? Say it again. Buddhist? Is that what you said? Oh, I thought you said Buddhist. Okay. You don't want assassinations? Oh yeah, we got you off the phone too. Raise your hand if you want gangsters. Raise your hand if you want assassinations. Raise your hand if you. Huh? Oh, a super majority. So let's put it this way: who can bribe the vote count?
I have another.
It's over.
Why are so many other boys? Oh, because the children are taking children jobs.
Win or what? If we have one, let me think about it. Maybe really big. I'm going to make it really small. I don't want a big one.
You don't.
I don't? Is that a dare? Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Whatever we'll finish up any loose ends tomorrow. We'll have the test on Tuesday. And what we'll do is we'll start the next unit go before. I don't want to give a test on Monday either. So for you to decide. Monday? Test on Monday. Are those eggs? Oh, okay, now I can see the flat one. They look like other days. I might start the next one. Yeah. So if we do that, we'll talk about it. Any loose ends tomorrow or Monday. It'll be. There's a lot we can cover, but yeah.
Just make it
I gotta know what. Let me see the one we did on 5. Oh, let me get it for you. The whole thing. I gotta make another copy.
I had it done and then
I saw you working on it. It wasn't like you weren't working on it. I know you did it. This is the copy I was looking at. To get at that side, let me give you the other sheet.
I'll try to get to you tomorrow morning.
Well, you should know a lot of the answers.
Plus takes not like 8 o'clock tomorrow, so that's what I'll try to do. You have a zero period?
No, but if I'm not here, just drop it on my door.
Yep, I'll try.
I gotta do that right page. Too many pages. Just come up. What event you do?
Pole vault triple jump.
Oh, good. How are you doing so far?
Triple jump, like, using a lot better. Something's pole vault, but pole vault is getting there.
Have you done that before?
Yeah, I've done it since freshman
Oh, seriously.
I don't know how why I'm doing it. Last year, I told Road Company it's not thought I had so much job.
But then again, I know it's also pretty cool. You know, you do it well, it's an unbelievable feeling.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I know, that's what people talk about. Oh, yeah, I know it's dangerous. God, when that pole snaps and very joy, it's just.
Yeah, it's a very fun event. And last night, the coach just sit down and be like, yeah, pole vaulters are the best athletes in track. There's no doubt about that. You'll run fast, you jump high, keep your arms straight.
I don't think it would be a problem. You just have to call Allison Balbo. Period. If it works for you, let me know. Period. Because this tour is self-guided. And I'll give you the material. And what you need to turn in to Allison. Period.